We also want to review IT operations. One of the problems in IT operations is we have a number of people that have privilege level access. We have administrators, which of course could be system administrators, network administrators, database administrators. We have then security admins, and all of these people have the ability to do almost anything on our networks. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that we can't take that access away. They need that privileged access in order to be able to do their job. So we have to put in some types of compensating controls because we want to make sure that they're not going to misuse that access. And that could be either of course, accidentally or in some cases, unfortunately, intentionally. If we take a system administrator, for example, they can make changes to a system, they can change the configuration on it. So what do? We make sure that any time the change is made, it's logged. We record it so that we can go back to the sysadmin and say, who approved this change? We make sure that they realize they are not allowed to make a change to a system without then having proper change control and approvals. And what does this do? That helps, of course, protect us. We can now be sure that they are aware that anything they're doing is being monitored and they could be questioned on it. And in some cases, of course, that could be, a fairly serious offense if a change was made without proper permissions. Database administrators, of course, have access to pretty much everything. The challenge with, of course, our databases is that our databases today really contain the gold of the kingdom, if you want to use that term. Within our databases is all the most important information our company has. And the database administrators are the people that have ultimate access to that. They really have access to the most valuable things that our company has, and they need that. We rely on our database administrators to be able to manage those databases so they continue to be backed up, they continue to work correctly, and so on. And a very important role database administrators play. But a common problem we see is they share passwords. They share the same account, which means that if something went wrong, we don't even know which of the database administrators is the last to work on it or access that. There have been steps with some programs to try to make sure that a database administrator can't actually access the data in the database, but those have had a limited level of success. We also have security administrators who can set up security for all of our users. They can change people's security permissions. And again, we need to make sure that they realize they can't make those changes without then proper approvals and documentation. Our help desk personnel are keys to providing that customer support, to ensuring that our internal users and external users know who they can talk to if they're having problems. We call their very name the help desk. But one of the problems with the help desk is that they can reset passwords. How do we make sure that when a person calls in to have their password reset, the only password that gets reset is for their account, not for somebody else's? We, with help desk personnel, have to make sure that they realize the risks of things like social engineering and that they are careful to follow procedures that they're not going to then breach information or provide access or information to people that should not have actually received that. We also have the system operators, especially back in the mainframe. We had system operators that operated the systems, and they did everything from loading tapes and filling the printers, of course, to the backups and job operations. These people have to realize as well, they have a very high level of access. Something they do could disable the entire system. So we have proper procedures that might include things like they have to use a different password or a different account when they're doing administrator or operator level functions than they are when they're just doing their normal day-to-day tasks. With these people, this is where it's especially important we do a regular review of their access permissions. Make sure these people have then the correct level of access, but also once they leave that department or they leave that area, that access is, of course, taken away. We very much want to encourage that they are not using shared accounts. so we don't have any form of accountability or the ability to track what has happened on the system. The other thing we have to watch for is that for some organizations, they've put in systems that have been operating for a number of years. The people that helped then build those systems, many of them have retired. It could well be now in a company there's only one person that knows how that system works. And that means that person has become a single point of failure. If that person was to retire or get sick, it could well be that no one has the knowledge of how to support and run that system. As IT auditors, it's really important we protect our company by truly reviewing the people side of the equation. We look to see whether or not the people looking after our systems have adequate training. We check to make sure of whether or not our staff, for example, has then the cross-training and the support necessary so we don't have just one person that maybe knows that system. An important element to protect our organizations from, fraud and from mistakes is the idea of segregation, or sometimes called separation of duties. The idea of separation of duties will allow us to prevent or detect fraud by breaking a task into a number of different, segments. A good example is when a person submits their expenses. And when a person submits their expenses, then somebody else has to approve those. A person would not be allowed to approve their own expenses. What this does, of course, is it gives the opportunity that we could pick up on a mistake where the person, put in expenses that were not permitted or made an arithmetic mistake in preparing them. So the idea of having that separation of duties where somebody else has to actually then approve is a way then to prevent or detect fraud, as well as, of course, prevent or detect errors. Now, there is a risk with this. The risk with this, unfortunately, is that quite often we'll have what we call mutual exclusivity. A person may have the right to input data, or they could have the right to approve data. And in some cases, they may have both. The only restriction is they can't approve their own data. So that a person in one day could be doing input, another day could be doing approvals. This means they know the entire process. And as a person knows the entire process, that could aid them if they wanted to commit fraud. Now they know how the whole process works. And this is where we see a little bit of a problem that we as auditors have to watch for. And that is that in many cases, fraud is committed by internal employees, and usually by internal employees that have been with the company for an extended period of time. In many cases, fraud is committed by people in their 30s and 40s, sometimes early 50s, that have worked for a company, on average, usually more than 8 to 10 years. This comes from some of the work of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and their report to the nations. So we do have to watch out for this. The person who has that higher level of privilege within a department, that nobody questions their work, we still need segregation of duties. One area we should always watch for as auditors is the area of error handling. Quite often, 99% of our transactions flow through the normal process, but once in a while we have an error. And quite often those errors are handled by, say, a senior person in the group. And very often where normal transactions go through segregation of duties, the error handling doesn't. The error handling is just resolved by that person, which provides that person the opportunity to do something without anybody else watching their work. And where something already has been an error, there is a higher, opportunity maybe for malfeasance. So these are some of the things we look for. We want to make sure our systems are protected, well, for one, by having segregation or separation of duties, but also making sure that a person does not have that level of privilege that could allow them to do something without anyone else checking up on it or questioning it. So the area here can be addressed through things like dual control. Take, for example, the age-old story. You want to launch a missile. It takes two separate people turning a key at the same time. Even in a bank. Most banks, when you want to open the safe first thing in the morning, there's two combinations. And some of the staff knows the combination for the top lock, and some of them know the combination for the bottom lock, but nobody knows both combinations. So it takes two people then to open the safe. The idea of mutex, or mutual exclusivity, says that if you've done the one task, you cannot do the other. So this provides then a level of separation that quite often can be built into the logic of our systems that looks and says for the person who inputted a transaction, their ID would not be valid then to approve that transaction. Another thing we see is the use of mandatory vacations. Mandatory vacations are required in some industries, especially in the financial industry. The idea behind mandatory vacations is that a person is required to take at least 2 weeks of vacation per year. And during that time period, it's expected somebody else will sit down at their desk, handle their phone calls, handle their accounts. And the reason for this is to detect whether or not the person who's normally in that position is maybe doing something that's not compliant with the procedures. They're taking shortcuts, or maybe they are running a fraud. So the idea of mandatory vacations is that idea now that by having somebody else step in, we have the opportunity to detect some type of fraud. The idea, of course, in most cases, is we'll have a series of different types of controls. We'll have what we'll call proactive controls, such as a directive control that says what you can or cannot do, such as an acceptable use policy. We could have a deterrent, where we tell people if you do this, there will be disciplinary action. We could put in a preventative control, a fence that stops somebody from coming across the property. Those are proactive controls. We also have reactive controls such as a detective control that detects if something's wrong, well, like a smoke detector. We have then a corrective control which tries to contain if we've had a problem. That's what a fire sprinkler does. The smoke detector goes off and says you've got a fire. The fire sprinkler now suppresses or puts out that fire so that at least it doesn't spread. And then, of course, we have the recovery controls where we rebuild, get back to normal. Those are more reactive. In most cases, we are going to use a series of these controls working together to protect us both through managerial or administrative controls, through technical controls, and through, say, operational and physical controls. But there are times that those controls don't work. We need to put in compensating controls. Compensating controls are controls that we put in place to address a weakness or a gap in the control infrastructure. In this case, for example, where we have a compensating control, we realize that even though the controls we have are there, they're not quite enough because of, say, a high-risk area. So we put a control in place that will add another layer of defense to that. An example would be an administrator we talked about a moment ago. An administrator will put in additional monitoring so they know that what they do is going to be monitored and that they must be careful not to do something that they're not approved to do. We do things like balancing the number of inputs versus the outputs, so we know, for example, a person who handles cash, that whether or not the amount of cash that's in the cash drawer at the end of the day is correct. So that even though we've had things maybe like cameras, we've had ways of tracking on a cash register or a point-of-sale system the purchases and sales they've made, we still have a second person that counts the cash at the end of the day. We have logs, audit trails that allow us to see what a person has done. These, we can say, are, well, In some cases, these are detective controls, such as an audit trail would be a detective control. But it is also a type of compensating control because it's an additional control that we put in place to try to address an area where there's a higher level of inherent risk. We also can do independent reviews. A very good compensating control is where we have an independent auditor, or we have a person come in from outside that will review a process who might be able to see if there's something that's just not quite right in that area. One of the things we also do, of course, is provide training, making sure that people have the training and skills to do their job. That of course can make up for the fact if a person is in a high risk area, we give them additional training, additional reviews every year so they understand what are the risks associated with their level of responsibility and so on. Another important area to check, of course, are access permissions. We do regular reviews of access permissions for all of our users. This is essential to ensure that people are not able to gain a level of access which is not in agreement with what we'll call need to know. We have two concepts, need to know and least privilege. And they both deal here in many ways with both access and authorization. So a person, are they able to see a credit card number? Well, some people may need to see that credit card number, but least privilege says what can they do now that they can see it? For example, maybe they can see it, but they can't change it. And do they have the ability to create a new record or delete a record? Least privilege says that I'll only give a person the level of access they need so that they can do their job. But I'll only give them that level of access for the time they require it. So what this does in many cases is this makes sure that the level of access a person has then, for example, is only that necessary, read only, write only, create, delete, and that maybe that access only works during normal business hours. If a person tried to use their account at 2 o'clock in the morning, that account certainly just wouldn't work. Quite simply, it's not authorized to log in at strange hours of the day or over the weekend. Now this, of course, as you understand, can be a problem if we need somebody to work overtime. But these are the sorts of controls we'll put in place using least privilege, so that if a hacker tried to use a person's account during the night, that account simply wouldn't work. That least privilege helps protect that person. We also, if a person doesn't need to see a certain piece of information, such as a credit card number, we might only show the last 4 digits. Why? Because that means that they can't be tempted to misuse it or even be accused of having misused that information. This is building security into our systems so that a person's level of access is only that which is appropriate. And what that does is it actually protects our employees so they are not going to be subject to social engineering, for example. It's important that when we set up a new user, that we have a secure process for setting up new users, registering them on the system, so their level of access is according to what is required for their job, and that access has been approved by their manager. We also have to maintain and manage the access of our existing users. The problem we can easily have here is that our existing users, for example, quite often their access grows over time. They've worked on a project here, they've worked in a department there, and as they've moved around, the problem, of course, is they get higher and higher levels of access and more access in different areas. This is not in line with the best practices of least privilege. So we should manage and maintain their access so that it still is what do they require to do their job, and that the access that they no longer require then is disabled and taken away. Now, when a person leaves the organization, their access should be disabled or removed or whatever the best thing is to do. In some cases, we don't remove it because we'll just disable it. And the reason for that is we may need to access them. Maybe they have files or something that would be lost if we actually remove their user access. But we disable it. We make sure that people that are no longer working for the company, that their access is no longer there. So it could not be misused.